Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Creating Space. I'm your host, Scott Lackey, and we are here to create space for compelling conversations as it relates to the Christian faith or following Jesus. And our hope here is that we can have some conversations that would maybe go beyond Sunday morning. Maybe we can dig into some topics and some ideas that can challenge a little bit, that can stretch us a little bit and help us grow. So thank you for tuning in to this month's episode. We release a new episode on the first Thursday of every month. And if you have a question or an idea or something you'd like to hear us talk about on the podcast, you can send me an email at scottlackey@newstorybuffalo.com. That's scottlackey@newstorybuffalo.com. Send me an email. I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions as we dive into different conversations, hopefully compelling and complex conversations. We can create space for that in our Christian walk. And today we have a very special guest on Creating Space, a professor of mine, somebody who maybe I can say she's a friend as well. She's at least a very friendly person, and I've enjoyed getting to know her over the past few years. Today on Creating Space, we have Dr. Lynn Cohick. Dr. Cohick has a PhD in New Testament on Christian origins from University of Pennsylvania. She has published commentaries on Ephesians and Philippians and books and articles on women in the New Testament, Jews and Christians in the ancient world, and early Christian martyrs. She is president of the Institute for Biblical Research and is a member of the prestigious Society of New Testament Studies. She serves on several editorial boards of journals and monograph series. And as I said, she's one of my professors at Houston Christian University. It's an honor to have you on here, Dr. Cohick. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Scott, for inviting me. Yes, we're definitely friends. I like that. That can be enough of an intro for me. So yeah, thanks so much for letting me talk with you about biblical texts, which is my love. So it's great.
Me as well. I love being able to dive into the scriptures. And, part of the heart behind this podcast, as I talked about in the beginning, was I was noticing sometimes in my preaching on Sunday mornings, I was nerding out a little bit, and I think I might have been losing people here and there. And then also I just started thinking, this 15-minute rant that I just went on, this was important information. But when I'm thinking about the daily struggles of what people might be facing, maybe this isn't the best time to be talking about what I'm talking about. And I thought, well, how do we talk about these things? So that's why we created the podcast. And so today we're going to be talking about something very interesting, Peter and wives in 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, Dr. Cohick, I have to confess something. I love the New Testament. I study the New Testament. I have not spent a lot of time in 1 Peter, I have to admit.
Usually it's Paul or Jesus. And really, it should always, I should say it in reverse order. It should always be Jesus, right? And the Gospels that we spend most time in. But I think the Apostle Paul's letters tend to take the lion's shares of our attention.
Yeah, they really do. And I love this because when it comes to husbands and wives and building out a biblical study or building out our theology, a lot of times we just go to Ephesians 5 and assume that's all there is to say. Maybe a little bit of Genesis 1 and 2 as well. We'll go back to the Old Testament as well. But, there's 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. There's some stuff going on here.
Oh, yeah. And it's 1 Peter as a letter itself is so rich, even in trying to help us understand who Jesus is. There's some beautiful metaphors. Yeah, I would encourage your listeners to read through it. It's not that long of a letter, and you can do it in one sitting.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to read 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. Is that right? Would those be the right verses?
Yes.
Awesome. And if you're following along, we're reading 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that even in some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was in this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. Thus, Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fears alarm you. Husbands, in the same way, show consideration for your wives in your life together, paying honor to the woman as the weaker sex, since they are too also heirs of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing may hinder your prayers. Man, that's a complicated text right there. There's that could definitely spawn a compelling conversation in today's context.
Yes, yes, it absolutely can. Whenever we see that word submit, I think it raises sometimes a red flag with people. What is going on, and especially in the context of women to men, or in this case, wives to husbands. It feels like they're setting up kind of a two-tiered system in a marriage or something like that, and so it is worth examining our own presuppositions, as we should anytime we approach a text. And then also, I think, understanding the situation that Peter is addressing will help us understand what he's really hoping people will take from his words. I mean, we're 2,000 years beyond his time. So it helps to kind of see, well, okay, what was the lay of the land where he was, to help us better understand what he's talking about.
That's good. Yeah. So I guess that brings us to, you have an understanding of First Peter. You obviously spend a lot of time studying the scriptures. What got you interested in this specific text? What made you say, I need to take a second look at this or take a deeper dive into this?
Well, I am doing a project, a chapter for a book, and one of the questions that emerged, given what this book overall is about, was, what is a good wife? And I was thinking about that in relation to Esther, the book of Esther, which has Esther as a good wife and Vashti as a bad wife. I mean, that's very simplistic and it's probably wrong, but that's how people think of it. And so it got me pondering that question: where in the New Testament are there pictures of the wife and the husband? And as you mentioned earlier, Ephesians is right there, and I've written a lot on Ephesians, but not so much on First Peter. And in First Peter, we have a woman who is a believer, but married to someone who's not, which is kind of like how Esther is, as a Jew, but she's married to a pagan. And so that, it just interested me, like, okay, well, what's going on? Let me try and explore, just explore what the Bible might be saying in these contexts. So yeah, so that's what got me started in a close reading of this passage.
That makes, yeah, because like I said, I've done very little work in First Peter, but when you read this at a first glance, accept the authority of your husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they'd be won over without a word by their wives' conduct. I could very easily see that specific verse and even the following verses be misapplied in such a way that could keep a wife or a woman in a potentially toxic or dangerous situation. And I imagine that this verse has been used that way before, even in pastoral counsel, which is, I would say, not good, most likely a misuse of what's going on here. Maybe
Totally.
not, but I would
No,
say
totally.
most likely.
Yeah.
And so how are you wrestling through that? How are you looking at this? What is it that you're learning about this text that hopefully when maybe a wife in a difficult situation comes across this, she's not saying, am I being disobedient or cringing or something like that? What are you noticing and seeing here?
Right, right. Well, I think right out of the gate in verse 1 of chapter 3, the verb that is used is to submit, hupotasso. And the form of that verb in our verse is like an ing verb in English. Running to the store, I got there right on time. So, like, I got there right on time is the main verb, and rushing is more of a descriptor. Um, both of my life in real, really, because I'm always rushing, but also it further describes how I got there on time. I was rushing.
Yep.
And so both here in 3:1 and then also earlier in chapter 2, in verse 18, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters. That also is an ing form of the verb. The command, which the command form, what we call imperative, that occurs actually in chapter 2, verse 13. My translation has submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. I don't know what your translation has there.
Let me pull this up.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. What verse were you reading from again?
Chapter 2, verse 13.
Chapter 2, verse 13. Here we go. It says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. That's the NRSV.
And so what's interesting is that then that same verb, when it's used for the wife in 3, it's about authority, right? It's about the husband's authority. It doesn't say submit. They translate it differently. What do you have that in front of you? Because I have a different translation. But I don't think you use the word submit.
No. I think it says verse 1. We're looking at chapter 3, verse 1. It says, wives in the same way accept the authority of your husbands.
Yes, accept the authority. To me, that sounds different than submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Like that verse in chapter 2, verse 13 is spoken to the whole church, men and women, and it is a posture of submission that every single Christian is to have towards authority. And the authority he's talking about is the emperor, or today we might say the king, and or queen, and the governors, the more local people. And so the obviously they didn't have democracies in I mean, they had an ancient democracy in Athens that was somewhat similar to what we have today, and then again very, very different. So you had in Peter's day, you had the emperor, you had a monarchy, an imperial force. Everyone is to submit. And so that idea of submission is not connected to only wives or only to wives and slaves. And submission does not mean that you give up all agency. So when Peter says to all the believers, submit yourselves to every human authority, whether to the emperor. Yeah, but the emperor might demand that you honor him as a god. Well, then you're absolutely not supposed to submit. He doesn't have that kind of authority over you. And so to translate then in 3 verse 1 that the husband has authority over his wife is I think an overreach of the translation, because the submission the wife's submission to her husband never supersedes her own agency and her own commitment to God. That has to always be first. So if we stay in chapter 2 there in verse 13, we are to the command to submit ourselves to for the Lord's sake to every human authority. And then in verse 17, we have some more commands. We're commanded to honor everyone or show proper respect to everyone. And that word, honor, that verb is also used in our passage that you read in chapter 3, verse 7.
Yep.
Sometimes it's translated as respect, that the husband respects his wife, but it's the same verb. So I just point this out, that sometimes we change the translation to make it sharper or stronger if it relates to a husband's relationship to his wife than we do when it's just like show proper respect to everyone. Well, yeah, we should always do that, right? Like that just makes sense. And so husbands, in the same way that you respect everybody, you should also respect your wife rather than say, or honor your wife. So in other words, there's a lot more commonality between how husbands and wives interact with each other and how all believers should interact. And I think today, sometimes we feel that there is just one or two virtues, such as submission, that are only for the wife out of all people. And the text just doesn't support that. If we stay for a minute here in chapter 2, verse 17, show proper respect or honor everyone, love your fellow believers. And that's the verb there, love, is like the really awesome to love verb, from which we also get the noun agape. Maybe some people will recognize that, the agape love, the really deep love. So love your fellow believers, fear God, that's a command, and honor the emperor. So show proper respect and honor the emperor. That's the same verb that's used. And I think sometimes in English we like to avoid repetition. And so that may be why the translators did both proper respect and honor, even though the verb itself in Greek is repeated. But anyway, that frames things. That's, as Peter then will get into the discussion with both slaves and women, the overall attitude that believers should have one to another and to the wider world is shared by, then, in some ways, the slaves and the wives. In other words, the wives and the slaves are not singled out as being expected to have a particular posture that the free men and the non-married women would not have to worry about.
So that changes it up a little bit. Do you have a thought then on, okay, if this is maybe more so, if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, this is maybe more so a general expectation of all believers. Why do you think it is that maybe Peter does highlight the slaves and wives?
Yeah, because so he inherited, Peter and Paul, the whole New Testament, inherited a world framed by categories that Aristotle, 400 years earlier, had established. Aristotle thought that it would be good to structure the city, the polis, the entity, the political entity, using three main categories that you find in the home. For him, it was husband, wife, parent, child, and master, slave. Those were constant, and he felt that if you got those relationships right, you could build a city on them. So that's why Paul in both Ephesians and Colossians also mentions those pairs. Peter doesn't mention children here, but in mentioning slaves and wives, it's because that's what the household was like. And, the earliest church met in households, and they had people in the church who fit these categories. I mean, there were other people like widows, freedmen, freed women, people divorced also. I mean, there was a lot of different categories than just what Aristotle established, but these were the three main pairs that were always arranged in a hierarchical manner. And so the church lived in that culture. Okay, so now the gospel comes and you have this freedom in Christ, and you're also called to live a holy life, and you're a slave. Well, can you really be a Christian and a slave? Is that possible? And Peter says, yes, here's what it looks like, and can you be a wife of an unbelieving husband who is pagan, who may be asking you to give daily offerings like a libation, some drops of wine in the local hearth as you make the dinner? Are you raising the kids to honor the gods of your husband's ancestors? Well, if you're a Christian, that's going to be pretty hard to do. So can you even be a Christian and be married to a pagan? Paul looks at this question a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He comes at it from a different angle than what Peter does, but it's a live issue at this time as the gospel moves beyond the Jewish community where Jesus taught to the wider Greco-Roman world. And you had people who maybe were raised, I'm calling them pagans, the idolaters, right? They were not Jewish, but they could convert to Christianity, but they didn't have to become Jewish, you know? And so you've got, there's some category changing here.
Yeah.
And Peter's trying to address it and say, yeah, you can be a faithful follower of Jesus. There's just some complexity. So I'm going to talk to you about it.
That's so good. I've never thought of it that way before. Honestly, this is one of those texts I haven't always known what to do with. Like I said, once again, I'll admit it again, I don't spend a lot of time in First Peter. And then you look at this one, you're like, I don't know what to do here. But you're seeing it through the lens of, and correct me if I'm wrong, wife, if you were in a situation where your husband is not a believer, here's the conduct that I'm encouraging you to consider.
That's right.
In that context. That's
right. That's right. So as we enter into the specifics of chapter 3, I just want to emphasize that Peter is very cognizant, very aware of the fact that some of the believers are being mistreated. So he will talk about in chapter 2, verse 20, he will talk about owners who are unjust, who are harsh, and he condemns them. So he's not saying that a slave should just put up with whatever, although they really don't have a way to resist. What Peter does is he names the harshness, and he, in naming it, is stating this is unjust treatment of you. Now, he then goes on to say this is what Jesus also experienced, and so you are sharing in the injustice that also happened to Jesus, and God will vindicate you just like he vindicated Jesus. So it's like naming the problem and stating that Jesus, in going through in some way what the slave is also going through, in a sense, brings it honor, as well, also saying that it's an earthly injustice. The other thing that is mentioned in chapter 2, Peter says you are to submit to the emperor, to the governor, for it's God's will that by doing good, you will silence the ignorant talk of the foolish. This is a really important point to make because he's going to pick up the same idea when he talks about the wives. So it's really important for Peter that people act in a virtuous way. Now, virtue, in the definition of virtue, has some crossover between the pagan world and the Christian world. Like you're to be honest, you're to be kind. There's some things, but when it comes to practicing idolatry, which for the pagan would be, well, that's how you love your neighbor, is you propitiate the gods, you make sure the gods are worshipped, and that keeps our society going well. But a Christian can't do that. The Christian only serves the one true God. And so they're being antisocial, right? I mean, when you think of it that way, it's kind of, it's not an easy concept for us to appreciate today, but in the ancient world, I mean, Christians could be seen as atheists.
Yep.
And so, so he's wanting the Christians to do good as much as they are able, so that no one can say, oh, those are bad people over there.
Right.
So so now I'll dive in after all that long preface. When we look finally at chapter 3, verse 1, you find that wives submitting to your husbands, so that if any of them don't believe, they'll be won over by your good behavior, right? Like you silence the foolish talk, right? Now the goal that Peter has here of winning over the husbands so that they become believers also is incredibly subversive. In the ancient world, the wife was to follow the religion of her husband. This is all over the place in various writings. The assumption is that the wife will take on not just the specific gods or goddesses of her husband, but also his friends. Like the wife becomes an accessory, I don't know how else to say it, of her husband. And here Peter is saying, actually, your behavior can shift your husband away from his family gods, from his allegiance to his pagan friends, and bring him into the church.
Yeah, and he's like affirming her agency too. You can make a decision. You can be you don't have to go along with the cultural norm. I mean, this is what I'm saying based from what you're saying. This is really cool.
Yeah. So the just like all the believers are to do good, so too the wife is encouraged to do good. And Peter goes on to say, without words. So, and I don't think he's saying that wives are by nature nagging creatures and so shouldn't talk, but rather think again back to verse 15 in chapter 2, that your good works silence the slander. And that's what he means here also. Walk the walk, right? Don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And that may be very persuasive. And then he goes on in verse 3 to say that now my translation, which is I think the NIV, says your beauty, that is the woman's beauty, the wife's beauty, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles, the wearing of gold jewelry, and fine clothes. It should be your inner self. What's interesting, though, is that the term beauty is not in the Greek. What the Greek is stressing here is this idea of purity and reverence, which is what we have in verse 2, that your husband will see the purity and reverence of your life, which doesn't come from outside stuff, but comes from this inner person. And the language is like from your heart, but it's this inner self. And sometimes in the ancient world, when they want to talk about your whole being, they use the word heart, like your whole self, your inner self. They don't mean the heart as like the seat of emotions the way we might today. It's your whole inner self. And Peter describes that as incorruptible, imperishable, not, in my translation I have here, unfading beauty. It's not, Peter is not contrasting, I'll sum it up here. It's not contrasting the woman's outward physical appearance versus her inward beauty. We kind of have a cliche even today about that, right? Real beauty is inside yourself. And I mean, that's true, but that's not what Peter is getting at here. He's really honoring the wife in saying, you have this inner self that is imperishable, incorruptible, because it is in Christ. I mean, he has already said to everyone that the church is a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. And so the wives are also part of that group and have that characteristic. And so that that's what Peter is describing again in the context of the marriage. So that's what the wives bring. Now, and we can talk about Abraham and Sarah in a minute, but as I was researching this passage, I was thinking, okay, how would this actually work out in practice? How would this, did the husband at breakfast one morning say to his wife, I want what you have. You have such a pure and kind and non-anxious presence. You have a glow about you that is like a joy that's totally distinct from our circumstances. Tell me about that. You know what I mean? Like that.
Right.
And yeah, and I don't know. I've never heard anybody preach on how this practically happened. So I don't know, but Peter seems to imagine that eventually the husband and wife will have a conversation, and he will hear the gospel message and turn to Christ through her. Yeah. So that, like, getting back to your point of agency, that's just tremendous agency.
Yeah, for sure. I love that idea. Now, as you're working through this and you're looking at some of the languages, you mentioned Sarah and Abraham as well. I mean, that's one of the verses I honestly paused. I was like, what do we do here?
Yeah.
Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. That's the NRSV. The NLT says called him Master.
Mm-hmm.
And you have become her daughters as long as you do what is good. Now, I look at this in a couple ways. I'm like, well, okay, are we classifying Abraham as an unbeliever here? And then also this whole thing of she called him Lord. Like what contextually is going on here with the Sarah and Abraham example? How does that fit the narrative that we've been building up to at this point?
Right. Yeah. Well, and just to your point about Lord, the word is kurios. So it can also mean sir. So she's not confessing that in some way Abraham takes on any kind of deification or, in that kind of thing. It sometimes is translated kurios as Lord. I'm sorry. And then sometimes, so it is a title of Jesus for sure. But in just common conversation, it can also mean sir. And we do translate it sometimes that. So, but the bigger question I think you raise is, so what should we know about this couple? What is Peter thinking about as he draws on their example? Well, twice, not once, but twice, Abraham gives Sarah to a pagan, chieftain.
Yeah.
Once to Pharaoh. So in Genesis 12, Abram, as he's known at that point, gives Sarai to Pharaoh. He says to Sarai, claim that you are my sister, which was sort of partly factual, but not the whole truth.
Right.
She was his wife. And Pharaoh takes Sarai as his wife. And the Lord protects Sarai from this
interesting scenario.
Who has her. And then second time he does it is in Genesis 20. He's in the Negev, which is like the Sinai. And he gives Sarah to Abimelech, who is the king of Gerar. And that king has a dream, and the Lord warns him, don't go near Sarai. So he gives her back to Abraham, and he gives Abraham even some gifts. I'm a little troubled as to why Abraham makes out financially with this scheme, but I'll just have to defer to my Old Testament friends.
Well, someone else take care of that.
Friends. Yeah, look, they can sort that. But I think that in both times, Sarai is in a household of a pagan, just like this believing wife who is in the household of a pagan. And the Lord both times totally protected her and kept her safe. And so that, I think, is where Peter is going. And I would say, especially because the very last lines of this passage, or of verse 6, Peter says, you're her daughters, with the result that sometimes people say, if you do, but it's not contingent. They are the daughters. They absolutely are Sarah's daughters, with the result that you'll do right, but then not give way to fear. And in the Greek, there's both the word for fear and another word for terrifying fear. Like, do not give way to frightening fear, or to fear that is very frightening. And so we know that all the believers could face physical abuse for their testimony, and slaves and wives especially would be the most vulnerable of the categories. Children also, they had no kind of child protection laws back then.
No.
So the vulnerable in society faced physical harm. And I think by using two different words for fear at the end, Peter recognizes that these wives are in a very vulnerable and dangerous situation, given that they are incredibly subversive in their household by claiming Christ. And so he wants to acknowledge that. He names that. And he points to a time in the Old Testament where there was another such wife, very famous matriarch, and God took care of her. So I think that might be what's going on here. And in today's terms, then, I think we want to be very careful to interpret as Peter meant the words, instead of just assuming we can lift them off the page. As you mentioned earlier, this text has been used to insist that women stay in violent homes. But that's exactly not what Peter is saying. He is not condemning violence. He is not condoning violence in any way. The church should protect those who are most vulnerable. So Peter is giving this believing wife agency to figure out how she can best be faithful in her home. He's not giving her a list of do this, don't do that, but he's trusting her that she'll make the right decisions through the power of the Spirit, the wisdom of the Lord, with the hope that her husband will come to faith.
That makes a lot of sense contextually. And the Sarah Abraham thing, we don't think of it that way, because we maybe romanticize Abraham, or maybe even borderline deify him at times. Oh, he's the one who faithfully followed God, and he almost sacrificed his son. Look at all the great things Abraham did. And he made some dumb decisions. I mean, it just is what it is. He made some dumb decisions, and I get it. We are all sinners. We can all make some dumb choices, but he did some dumb stuff, some pagan stuff, some stuff that would have made Sarah as his wife feel unsafe. And based on what you were saying, I actually like here how the New Living Translation interprets verse 6. It says, "You are her daughters when you do what is right, without fear of what your husbands might do."
Exactly. Yes, that is spot on.
That's a great contextual framework based off of what Peter is saying here, based off of the argument you're making in Abraham and Sarah. And this also reminds us that Sarah was honored and used as an example here. it's not just let's only remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. No, let's look at Sarah as well. Let's look at let's take a look at Rebecca. Let's take a look at some of the other women who are mentioned in the story, and also the example that they set. Not that they were just placed there as secondary characters. No, there's an example from them as well. And this actually gives, I think, hope to a lot of wives, and possibly even a message of strength and courage.
Yes, yes. And, as we finish with verse 7, directed to the husbands, it's a little bit shorter here. They are to live with your wives in a considerate way. And I don't know if these are Christian wives or non-Christian wives. But I think it'd be interesting if they are non-believers, then the husband is not given the right to push the wife into a conversion. But it seems more like they are probably both Christian, because they talk about at the end of the verse that the wife is as an heir with you, a co-heir with you, the gracious gift of life. So whether, commentators debate exactly what the status of the wife is here, but it's very clear that the husband is to treat the wife with respect, to honor the wife, just as you honor the emperor, and to live well with her. Now, it mentions weaker partner, and that has someone who is weaker. A weaker vessel is the specific word in the Greek, but vessel is used metaphorically here, obviously. So the weaker vessel, given what Peter has laid out as the believing wife's responsibility towards her unbelieving husband, and the agency that she has in doing good and virtuous acts of service to him and to the wider community, I don't think the word then weaker here implies a moral weakness, a gullibility, irrationality, the kinds of things that Aristotle certainly thought women were by nature less rational, more emotional, just weaker all the way around in terms of their innate femaleness. Rather, I think what is, or another way to see this, is not that Peter is accepting Aristotle's view of the female, but rather that he is recognizing the vulnerability that the wife has in the marriage, and in general within society. Although there are obviously wealthy women who did have tremendous social power, but in our context, I think we're probably dealing with the lower end, economic end of society in the church. And so to recognize that the husband has authority and power given to him from society, but he is not to use that for his own gain in any sense. If he does, his prayers will be hindered, which is huge. I mean, when you think about it, like, if he mistreats his wife, God won't hear his prayers.
Well, and this too, because a lot of times people ask about dating advice or marriage advice in the church. What do you do? How do you figure that out? And you're like, well, the Bible really doesn't say anything about dating, and it does say some stuff about marriage, but it's very little. And then what do you do? Well, consider maybe a cruciform disposition that you would consider in all relationships. And that looks like letting go and releasing and surrendering power, status, all worldly forms of honor for the sake of the other. And that makes complete sense in this context.
Exactly. And so I think that's what the husband is called to do. And, the penalty of not doing it is your prayer's not being heard. That's a very frightening place to be. Like the heaven's door is shut right in your face.
Yeah.
That would scare, I don't know how much it scares us today, but it would certainly scare the ancients.
I need to go home and talk to Kim and say, Kim, I want to make sure the Lord's hearing my prayers and my, anything I need to repent of. Um, let me ask you this. Let's think of the two extremes right now. The one extreme that has a tendency to read this passage on a surface level and say, this is the way it is. This is what women need to do. This is what men, blah, blah, blah. This is what text, let's go with it. And then the other extreme that reads this passage and says, oh my goodness, the Bible is so dated. I can't believe Peter's view. This is ridiculous. I can't believe people still respect this text. Do you have maybe a quick word of warning or quick little quip for both extremes? The extreme that just says, it says it, let's settles it, and the extreme that says, this is dated information. We just need to ignore this part of the Bible.
Yeah. I think both assumptions are rooted in this idea that the Bible is easy. And it's not. It is available to everyone. You don't have to have a degree in order to understand it. You don't even have to read if you hear it read to you. But that doesn't mean that it's simple or easy. And so this idea, well, the plain meaning of the text, we don't communicate as adults with plain meaning. There's always metaphor and nuance and context. That's why it's so fun to be around 2- and 3-year-olds when they're learning language, like your son, right? Like he's learning words and he's, and it's like,
man.
And they make so many mistakes and have no concept of grammar, but then they eventually kind of just develop that. And so as an adult, we take all this stuff for granted as we communicate, but it's necessary for understanding each other that we do pick up the relevant, unspoken, like the tone of voice and just all kinds of things. Well, that same reality is happening in the Bible. So for those who say, let's just, the simple, plain meaning, it's like nobody talks that way. And certainly Peter didn't talk to his adult congregation that way. But for those that say, oh, it's just locked in history, I say, well, as someone who likes history, that's not so bad. But also to them, it's like, it's worth the effort to understand that person's culture. Just like I bet if you meet someone who has moved to your neighborhood from overseas, you're like, yeah, let's have a potluck and everyone make their favorite dish. I want to learn about your community. Now they're both, that other culture will bring its own history with it. And it's kind of fun to learn it. And that's what you're doing. You're developing a relationship with God as his child, and you're doing so through his self-revelation, which was first given to a different culture than your own. But that's all right. We're used to engaging with different cultures. It's fun.
That's good. Yep. No, those are helpful analogies, really good stuff. As you've been studying this, if somebody's listening to you right now and saying, I want to jump into 1 Peter, are there any resources you would recommend?
Yeah, there are 2 commentaries that I think are really well done. They're both written by women.
Okay.
One commentary is written by Ruth Ann Reese, Reese, and the other commentary is written by Karen Jobes.
Karen Jobes.
Jobes. Yeah. She's such a beautiful writer. And, I think maybe Karen's has more Greek in it, but you don't need to read the Greek. Just skip over that. But it shows you the work, I mean, it's like, don't just give me the 2 + 2 = 4, but show me how you got there. And I think that lends credibility to people's arguments. I mean, you don't have to read it. You can just go to the summary, but it's there if you want to get more info. And I think both of these scholars show us the depth of Peter's argument, not just here in what we looked at, but how he understands the church, which is really beautiful. And Jesus, the lover of our soul, the great shepherd. Peter does a beautiful job developing that.
As we come to a close here in just a few moments, thank you so much for your time, by the way.
Yeah.
I have 2 more questions and then a few quick get to know you questions.
Okay.
But the first question before we get to those questions is there anything else about this text that you're thinking, I really wanted to say this or I didn't get to it and I want to just make this clear. I wish I would have said that a little bit differently. Anything like that?
Nope. I think your questions and our conversation, I think we hit all the important points.
Yeah, you did great. I mean, I'm looking at this text in a new way already. And I've always wondered what to do. And now I'm like, Dr. Cohick, I know what to do now.
Okay.
And then on a more serious note, and I did not prepare you for this in any way, but I just feel like there's a potential opportunity here. From a pastoral perspective, something that both you and I have mentioned is this text could be and definitely has been used in situations to keep women in harmful circumstances. And maybe as you study this, you've thought through, and maybe you have, I imagine you have, just because I know the kindness of your heart. What would you say to maybe a woman who has experienced that before, who had this text has been misused, and maybe even because of that, it's put a bad taste in her mouth for scripture or for Christianity as a whole or the church, because this text has been abused in an abuseful situation. What would you say? What are some things that come to mind? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I think it's appropriate in a pastoral moment to consider what could be said. And I know it could be case by case and situation by situation, but I don't know if anything has come to your mind in that regard.
Yeah, thanks for that. Because I think this has been, some people call it weaponized. It has been used to say, women, keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, don't make him angry. All of those just horrible tropes that blame the woman for the husband's sin.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that in the midst of all of what was happening, the Lord did see. And so I would consider reading again the verses just before the verses that we looked at. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. There's a promise in that. You were seen, you are seen, you will continue to be seen by the loving Heavenly Father who has made a way of redemption through his Son, who bore our sins in his body on the cross. Jesus is the shepherd and the overseer of our souls, and he sees this. He does not condone it, and he will judge it in his perfect in his perfect justice. And then I would say that if the woman would open her heart to realize who she is in the deepest sense, who she is in Christ. She is a member of the chosen people. So she is someone who's chosen. She is royalty, a royal priesthood, which sits differently for women, I have to say. We can, as women, through Christ, our high priest, enter the Holy of Holies, which was denied for God's purposes. I mean, not questioning what he was doing in setting up the tabernacle and temple, where only certain tribes and only men in those certain tribes could participate in the priestly service. Now, a man or a woman, we are part of a royal priesthood. We can make our offerings right there to God. And that we are God's special possession. And it's not easy to have that sink into your bones if the church and if someone who was pledged to love you has treated you very differently than that. But that's where allowing the Holy Spirit to really bring that truth to you is so important. And at a practical level, I would say, pray that the Lord would lead you to some other people who can affirm your chosenness and your status as a special possession. It's very hard to do it by yourself. And so to ask the Lord to bring others into your life that would affirm that. Yeah.
That's good. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm believing that'll help someone out there who might be in a difficult spot or who's been in a complicated season or a situation of abuse, or this has been weaponized, as you said. So thank you for sharing that, Dr. Cohick.
Yeah.
Let's take a moment here and just get to know you real quick. I do this with all my guests because I typically have either pastors or professors on. And pastors, a lot of times we're seen as, oh, they're just the people who speak on Sunday mornings, don't know much about us. And professors, are they the people who are like off in ivory towers reading books that nobody else will read? Well, no, we're all humans too. We're people too. And so I find it fun to get to know our guests just a little bit more. So, Dr. Cohick, what is your favorite dessert?
Whew. Okay. Well, probably cookies. Although I do not like chocolate chip cookies.
Really?
Isn't that so random? But like Christmas cookies, the sugar cookies, or
I
snickerdoodles, love those.
Snickerdoodles, my favorite.
Oh, my word. And the oatmeal raisin, peanut butter. I mean,
What about gingerbread or molasses?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yes.
No,
Love
yep.
that.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
So, so I would say that, and in that category, I also like brownies if they're moist, real moist.
you don't want to like an old dry brownie.
No.
It's all no,
No, not worth the calories. No,
not at all. Not worth it.
no. But if it's good, then I'm all in.
See, Dr. Coke's a person too. We all like our desserts. We have our preferences. Do you have a favorite movie? A movie that is just always stuck with you, something you love?
Well, of course, The Princess Bride. Now that dates me, but I mean, that's just so awesome. A newer movie that I had so much fun watching. I realize it's kind of controversial, but I just had a lot of fun watching it. And that was Barbie, because I played with Barbies
Yep.
and horses. The Breyer horse collection. We didn't do too much clothes with Barbie, but just some of those scenes, like when her feet flatten down to the ground, and I think, oh yeah, we used to put those little high heel shoes on Barbie, my sister and I. So I think the movie highlights the kind of sexism that women deal with a lot, does so enough in a playful way. And at the end, Barbie realizes she might have been doing, or was doing, the same sort of reverse sexism to Ken. And I thought that was just a nice, sweet ending. And for Christmas, I always like to watch A Christmas Carol, the musical. That's pretty much, Charles Dickens. I just love that. I love that movie.
My favorite version of Christmas Carol is actually the Muppet Christmas Carol.
Oh, that's so good. We watched that again this year. Yes,
it's really
so
good. And have you seen the movie Spirited with Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds?
No.
It's really good. It's a musical, and Will Ferrell plays the ghost of Christmas Present. And the premise is every year they work underground. They work in another world, another dimension, and every year they choose a different Scrooge. And in this one, it's Ryan Reynolds. He's a greedy businessman.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah,
and it's a musical too. If you like musicals, I love it. It's a really good movie. So,
okay.
Christmas Carol. And then, what's your favorite non-Christian book?
The Dream of Scipio by Ian Pierce. Have you ever read that novel?
I have never read that. No, I don't read enough novels. It's a problem. Well,
it's what I love about it. It's actually 3 stories, and it's historical, so that shouldn't surprise you. One is with Jews during the Holocaust, and then it goes back to the very early medieval period, maybe like 7th century, I think, and then more ancient Rome. And these three stories are woven together. It is beautifully written. I really like that. I like history, and my dissertation looked at a 2nd century Passover homily that mentioned Jews a lot. So I've always been interested in the relationship of Christians and Jews. And so The Dream of Scipio does that. More recently, Joseph O'Connor has written My Father's House, I think, and then My Father's Ghost maybe just came out this past. Something with ghost in the title. But during the time that Rome was under Nazi occupation, and how this Monsignor, Hugh, was working to get Jews and also Allied soldiers out. It's a fascinating read and really well written. So those would be two that off the top of my head, I think, they stay with me, and I will. Well, the O'Connor books are much newer, but Dream of Scipio I've read a couple of times.
That's really good. I'll have to check those out. I got to read more novels. When I'm not reading for school or for sermon prep, I typically end up reading a comic book or a memoir. I love those.
Memoirs are good. Yeah.
Yeah, they're good too. Okay. Well, I think we got to know you pretty good there. I mean, do you have a hobby? I forgot to ask, do you have a hobby outside of reading, studying?
No, more, I shouldn't say sports. I really need to walk or run or bicycle. I love, but I don't know if that would count as a hobby. And I love to go to museums, but no, I don't.
Those are
like
good things. We'll say biking. You're a biker. Yeah. You're a biker. That's great. That's great. Well, thank you for letting us get to know you a little bit too, Dr. Cohick. And thank you for being on Creating Space. If people want to find you somewhere, where can they find you and follow you?
Yes. So they'll find me, of course, at Houston Christian University. But also I have a podcast, the Alabaster Jar. And so that comes out every week, and you can connect with me through that. I have a nonprofit called the Center for Women in Leadership, and you can get to that. The label is leadershipwithoutapology.org. So if you type that in, all one word, leadershipwithoutapology.org, and that'll take you to the center. So that'd be a couple of ways people can connect with me.
That'll be good. And we'll put links for all of those in the show notes. I'll put in links for some of your writings as well. I have your commentary on Ephesians and your commentary on Philippians. I could not recommend them enough. They are both fantastic and have been so helpful for me in developing different sermons and lessons and all of that. Well, thank you so much for being on this month's episode of Creating Space. This was incredible. I learned so much, and I know our listeners will as well. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Scott, for the invitation. It was a lot of fun to talk with you.
Anytime. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this month's episode of Creating Space. Remember, we're here every month to create space for compelling conversations as it relates to the Christian faith. And if you have something you'd like to hear us to discuss, just email me at scottlackey@newstorybuffalo.com. Please like the podcast, please share it with others, and subscribe. And we'll be back on the first Thursday of next month with a new episode of Creating Space.